It's enough of the commercials. I want to thank Lynn Barton, who sponsored tonight's lecture for the Angel Academy of Art, and then briefly introduce Alan Pascuzzi, who really needs no introduction. Alan's lectured here frequently. Previously was on our History of Art faculty here at the Institute, teaches at several universities, programs around Florence, but most importantly, as well as being a great art historian, he's a great practitioner of the traditional techniques, both sculpture and fresco making from the Renaissance in a contemporary idiom. So I give the microphone now to Alan. Thank you.
Yeah, I think my mic is turned on. Thank you, Simon. It's always a pleasure to lecture at the British Institute. It's one of my most favorite things to do. Thank you all for coming out this evening. The title of the talk tonight is How They Were Seen, Part 2, Renaissance Sculpture, or a subtitle, A New Look at Renaissance Art. Now, in my first talk that I gave a few months ago, also entitled How They Were Seen, I concentrated on major altarpieces like Cimabue's in the Uffizi and how it was actually seen in the Church of Santa Trinita. Okay, it was actually produced for that painting. And this is actually a reconstruction thanks to Claudio Chieri. Tonight, however, what I'd like to work on and what to explore are sculptures. Because when we walk through the museums in Florence, like the Bargello at left or the Accademia at right, we're confronted with works of art that are on pedestals and placed with other works for us to admire for their craftsmanship and beauty. But I think we must remember, however, that all of these works, okay, paintings, and in this case, sculptures, were not meant to be in museums. We can ask the question, therefore, do we see Renaissance sculptures as they were intended to be seen? Well, the basic answer to that is no. They were not meant to be seen in a museum. Instead, they were part of a context, a cultural fabric, a visual tradition that had meaning and a message that was significant to the patron and also to the viewer. Now, like in my first talk, I will address the same principal question. What if we could see Renaissance works of art, like the sculptures of Donatello or Michelangelo, in the way someone in the Renaissance saw them, in their original location, or if you want to put it in other terms, in their original habitat? Tonight, I would like to do just that. Return works of sculpture to their original appearance, in their original locations, and propose several reconstructions of how famous works in Florentine Renaissance sculptures looked in the time they were created. Now, this, in essence, is Fanta art history, okay, in which I will reconstruct digitally, okay, something that could never be possible in real life. This is one of my most interesting sort of quests, okay, to see things the way someone saw it in the Renaissance. Now, the main intention of these eventual reconstructions that I'll show is not, or I should say, is to arrive at new conclusions and perhaps new understandings of the appearance, function, and importance of Renaissance sculptures by viewing them, how they were seen. Now, the sequence of the talk is going to be as follows. Section 1 is going to be a brief introduction, in which I'll go into a sculpture that I actually produced, okay, that was actually changed, okay. Section 2, I'll get into a brief history of decorated sculptures. I'll be beginning with the Etruscans, the Greeks, and then the Romans, and finally into the medieval era. Section 3, I'll concentrate on early Renaissance works, specifically Donatello and Luca della Robbia. And then section 4, I'll concentrate on high Renaissance works, in particular Michelangelo's David. Section 5, I'll try to draw some conclusions from all of this. Now, the objectives of this talk are threefold. The first is to understand the standard ancient aesthetic of the decoration of sculptures. The second objective is to explore the connection between the ancient aesthetic of decorated sculptures and its revival or reinvention in the Renaissance. And the third objective is to propose a new look at Renaissance sculptures by visually reconstructing them to give an idea of how they were seen. Now, section 1, introduction, I want to go into a sculpture that I executed, it's at left, of Bishop Fulton's scene that I executed for a church outside of New York City. At left, you can see the sculpture as I finished it in my studio. And for me, it was actually perfect. Perfect in the sense that perfectly pristine white. This is what I had imagined that they had wanted. I sent the sculpture to the church, did not hear from them for 3 months. And then after 3 months, they sent me a picture of it in the church. I was horrified. And it's even painful to show you this picture, okay, in public. But as I began to look at this work in its original location, it started to make sense. I even started to forgive them a little bit. I realized that the original sort of intention for me was to create the essence of sculpture, pristine, white, pure. Okay, it's the element of creating an object and having it sort of admired for the object. But then I realized that in that context, it would not have worked. And them painting it, actually, I have to admit, quite well, even though his lips are a little bit too red, okay? I think that it works perfectly. And this is what I have to get into. And this actually made me sort of concentrate on Renaissance sculptures. I think the way that it was painted is exactly what happened in the Renaissance, which doesn't really sort of correspond to our nature or our desire for pristine white sculptures. And that's what this whole talk is going to cover, this change from our perceptions to what the perceptions were in the Renaissance. Now, what we have to concentrate on now are Renaissance works. Donatello's St. George, Donatello's David, Michelangelo's David. Did these have color also? And this is what I'm going to concentrate on tonight. So section 2, and this is necessary, this brief history of decorated sculptures, because we have to understand the ancient aesthetic. We're in the city of Florence, and we have to understand how there's this continuation, the Renaissance of this ancient aesthetic. Now, what is the ancient aesthetic? We start with the Etruscans, okay? There's this amazing sculpture in the Archaeological Museum, the Lartia Seanti, okay, sarcophagus, about 180 BC, in which it shows a woman, okay, on top of her sarcophagus, okay, in her sort of rich dresses. And if you look at it, it's not exactly well presented in the museum. But if you look at it closely, you'll notice that the cloak is decorated. The details of the earrings, the mirror, the head covering, it's all distinguished by color. Even the faces, I should say, the face and the hands are painted a flesh color to make her look real. And that, I think, if you look at this work in its entirety, is exactly what they intended. Not to produce a sculpture of this person on her sarcophagus, but to create the actual person. And you did this, or they did it through color. And it's actually, if this was restored, it would be incredibly a high visual impact. Now, not only did terracotta sculptures get painted, but even bronzes used color. If you look at Etruscan sculpture, the bronzes, like the Cometa 400 BC, in the Archaeological Museum also in Florence, you'll notice that the mouth is open and there are no eyes. Well, that's because the eyes and the mouth had additions of silver. There was probably silver teeth in the mouth. The eyes were also probably of some colored material, probably silver or ivory with black pupils. So you have to realize that even bronze works were colored to make them more than just a sculpture. If you go to the Greek tradition, which was actually at the same time as the Etruscans, the Korae figures, okay, these all were painted to make them more beautiful. The face, the hair, the hands were all painted. And they were usually painted to distinguish the chiton that was worn underneath and the hematon, which is on top, the two different colors. And the color actually allowed you to distinguish the two different garments. But even the designs were colored. We're used to basically white, pristine statues, but they were all colored with these bright, bright colors. Now, when you look at them, if anyone's been to the Archaeological Museum in Athens or the National Museum in Athens, you're going to notice that many of these have a red color, and that's because the red pigment on them was actually a red iron pigment that was used as an adhesive. The true colors were applied on top, and they were bright blues, greens, gold, and this was the ancient aesthetic of using color. If you go to the Parthenon in Athens on the Acropolis, we see it as this pristine white sort of structure on top of the Acropolis, but you have to realize that at right, it was highly decorated with gold in various colors. And this was for a reason, not just to decorate it. The color distinguished the gods, the kings, the heroic characters. The nude parts were painted with skin color to make them look real and go beyond the concept of stone. And if you look at this row of horses, you realize that the color also allowed you to distinguish certain features, okay, easily. Because in these large architectural structures, okay, the reliefs seen from far away sometimes got lost, like this row of horsemen. With color, they actually stand out, and you could see them from a distance. Now, Greek bronzes were also colored, specifically the Riace bronzes that were found off the coast of Riace in 1972. And if you go back to the moment they were created, they probably looked something like this. Now, this isn't my recreation. I mean, this is actually a recreation a reconstruction I'm not particularly fond of, but the color of the bronze recreated probably the tan skin. The attributes of the swords, the shields, and the helmets were all gilded or had silver on them. And if you look very closely at the faces of the sculptures down in Riace, you'll realize that the eyes were actually ivory. The lips were of copper, the teeth were silver. And if you reconstruct this with the golden helmet, these lifelike details with colored swords and shields gave them a real appearance. So one of the desires of the ancient aesthetic was to create something, not just a sculpture, but something that looked real. Now, the Roman tradition, the Roman sculpture tradition, took everything from the Greek practice of decorating sculptures, like this Augustus of Prima Porta. Statues of emperors were painted. The unpainted version is what we're used to, is that left. The painted version, this reconstruction, is that right. The armor, the details, the flesh, all these areas were all painted, okay? And it made the emperor come alive. Now, ironically, if you're ever familiar with Dwayne Hanson's work of the 1970s, these resin sculptures that were cast from individuals and colored, flesh color, with Bermuda shorts and Hawaiian shirts, Dwayne Hanson was much more closer to the ancient aesthetic of painting sculptures that he may have not even realized. So we look at these sculptures as almost gaudy, almost tongue-in-cheek. But in essence, that's what the Romans and the Greeks and the Etruscans wanted. Now, if you go to Roman bronzes, okay, the Roman actually aesthetic used gold. And the sculpture like the Marcus Aurelius that survived only because they thought it was Constantine was completely covered with gold. This has now fallen off. This is in the Capitoline Museum in Rome. But the gold gave it a spectacular visual impact outside. It must have glistened in the sun. So gold, okay, gives the impression of the emperor or also divinity. So what conclusions can we draw from the ancient aesthetic of decorated sculptures? If you really look at ancient sculpture, you realize that the standard practice was to paint stoneworks and make bronze works with colored details. The intent was to make them lifelike. Now, with time, the coloring has worn off. The gilding has faded or been covered with dirt, leaving them monochromatic. Now, this monochromatic appearance, I think, evolved into our modern taste for undecorated works. The ancient practice of painting sculpture with bright colors, in certain cases, goes against our modern taste for pure, pristine, white marble statues like we see in the British Museum, okay, the Parthenon statues. And in certain cases, the decoration on them, when it gets reconstructed, is almost considered gaudy, okay, and almost distasteful. Now, the question then arises, after the fall of Rome, did the ancient aesthetic of coloring and gilding sculptures survive? Well, the answer is sort of. From the fall of Rome to the Middle Ages, and I'm speaking extremely in general terms, the time period roughly from 500 to 1300 AD is difficult to determine, okay, actual trends of decoration of sculptures. The reason being, after the fall of Rome, the growth of Christianity, naturalistic works were considered pagan. Now, we get some early works like this by Tino da Camagliano, which is on the baptistry, but the tradition of colored sculptures basically disappears with the cultural taboo of making naturalistic figural works. Now, this is sort of true. Okay, you can actually make some exceptions. There were colored works in the Middle Ages. Usually, they were colored crucifixes and Madonnas. The best example that I could actually find and actually locate was actually the Volto Santo of Lucca, the Holy Face of Lucca, which is an over life-size crucifix, totally polychromed with gold touches on it. And this is supposedly done in even before that, in the 1st century AD. Now they even say that it was actually a little bit later. But in the Middle Ages, there was a tradition, but it was concentrated on essentially crucifixes and Madonnas. Now, from about 1000 or 200 AD, 1200 AD, with the advent of building ecclesiastical structures like churches, baptistries, there was a need for larger sculptural works. And in this case, and again, I'm speaking generally, the use of color or gold on these growing naturalistic works was reinvented. What are some examples? Well, the examples can be found specifically in reliquaries. And this brings it back to who kept these techniques alive. It was the goldsmiths and bell casters, and I gave a talk on this some time ago. The goldsmiths and bell casters kept the ancient sculpture techniques alive until the Renaissance. They were skilled in casting in various metals and also in the practice of using color on works, essentially for reliquaries like this bust of Charlemagne from 1350, in which you see gold, silver, rubies, smalt, yellow. Now, these ancient techniques and traditions, once again began to be used for larger works. And I think the best example we have is Andrea Pisano's doors of 1330 to 1336, the doors for the baptistry, in which the figures are entirely gilded, and this makes them visible from a distance, exactly in this ancient sort of tradition. Another example is the spectacular silver altarpiece of 1367 in the Opera del Duomo, 800 pounds of silver, based on the story of St. John the Baptist. And on this silver altarpiece, what you have is, and this is actually begun by Leonardo di San Giovanni, shows the use of color, bright color, with yellow and smalt on silver. And you get this use of color to bring out things and make them actually more decorated, exactly in this ancient tradition. Section 3, early Renaissance works. And we're confronted with works of primarily Donatello and Luca della Robbia. Now, when you look at the Renaissance, you could actually say in general terms that it's a revival of ancient forms in painting, architecture, and in particular for tonight, sculpture. But you have to ask, did Renaissance sculptors revive also the ancient aesthetic of decorating large figure works? Did they need it? Did they use it? Did they understand it? Did Renaissance sculptors see, colored or painted works? We can't be sure. Maybe Donatello and Brunelleschi, who actually went to Rome and actually dug things up. But I think in certain cases, the sculptors reinvented this need to enhance works with color, similar to this ancient aesthetic, as you saw, in the Augustus de Prima-Porta, with this decorated, sort of armor and flesh. Now, if we look at some of the very early works, the major works in early Renaissance sculpture, like the St. John the Baptist, which was for the Or San Michele of 1405 to 1417, Lorenzo Ghiberti uses silver eyes, in St. John the Baptist, very much like, the Riachi bronzes who use these ivory eyes and copper teeth. So he's using sort of that ancient aesthetic. Also, if you go to Santa Croce and you look at Donatello's Cavalcanti Annunciation of the 1430s in Pietrastirena, if you look very closely at this work, the Pietrastirena has a nice warm gray color, but this is enhanced with touches of gold. And if you look at all of the most detailed works of the relief, of the sculpture, you notice that they've been gilded. And it gives us this very interesting sort of contrast of the gilding, which draws your eye to, in essence, the most skilled or the most sort of difficult sort of details of the sculpture itself. Now, this brings us to the sort of the stage of, well, what about the big works? Renaissance sculptors likely decorated larger works for visual impact. Time has canceled out the original decorations, leaving only monochromatic works like we see in St. George, the St. George by Donatello. And this invites reconstructions of works with ornamentation, and to see these in their original locations to fully understand how they were seen. Now, I'd like to concentrate first off on the cantorie of Luca della Robbia and Donatello. These are both from the 1430s. These are now in the Opera del Duomo. Now, these two works were essentially organ pulpits, even though they're called choir lofts, The choir would have had a hard time actually fitting in all these, But they're mainly just around where the pipes where the organ were. They were both commissioned by the Opera del Duomo in the 1430s. They were eventually removed in 1688 for the Grand Ducal wedding and eventually set up in the Opera del Duomo Museum in the late 1800s. This is Luca della Robbia's and then Donatello's down below. If you look at Luca della Robbia's Cantoria 1430, you realize that the marble reliefs are not colored at all. Okay, there is an inclusion of 2 bronze putti, okay, and also a dark inscription of Psalm 150, but the white color dominates with this minimal use of color. In fact, if you look at it, you realize that the whiteness of this whole work is dominating. It's extremely sort of, the visual impact is in its sort of pristine purity. If you look at Donatello's Cantoria, okay, if you go to the Opera del Duomo, you're going to see that there's a lot of use of color in this, okay, Cantoria. And this is probably him returning to this ancient aesthetic. He has cut glass mosaic, gold leaf, porphyry, and even bronze touches with these heads underneath that look right down on you. Now, you can say that, yes, Donatello's is innovative for his sort of continuous running angels, which is very different than Luca della Robbia's sort of snapshots of these different musical characters. But, okay, he uses a lot of color. And you have to ask, well, why did he use so much color in all of his works? It's almost gaudy to our eyes. In fact, when I take students there, okay, like, ooh, what's sort of this? It's a little bit shocking. And I think we have to go back to where these were placed in the cathedral. Now, in the cathedral, if you're looking right down towards the high altar, okay, the lofts were above the 2 sacristies where the pipes are for the organs, okay? And we have to determine, well, which side was which, okay? Where was Donatello's and where was Luca della Robbia's, okay? And then we have to ask also, how were the Cantoria originally seen? Does this give us an indication of why Donatello used so much color? And I want to thank, there's a drawing of the Cantoria, and I want to thank Monsignor Tim Verdon, who actually sort of introduced me to this one publication. There's a drawing from the 1600s of the interior of the Duomo that actually shows and lists where the Cantoria were actually located. It's from Ferdinando del Migliore's Firenze Città Nobilissima Illustrata of 1684. Now, this book was published 5 years before the marriage of Grand Prince Ferdinand to Violante of Bavaria, when the Cantoria were actually taken down. And the drawing confirms that Luca della Robbia's Cantoria was on the south side, which is the right side, and that Donatello's was on the north side, or in this case, in our intents and purposes, the left side. Now, if you look at this, okay, the area of the altar, and I took this picture about 12:30 in the afternoon, and even though there's a lot of artificial lighting, you're going to realize that on the right-hand side, it gets direct sunlight. Okay, this is actually the sun coming in. On the left-hand side, it doesn't get light. In fact, without the natural lighting, this probably would be a lot darker. But the one that's getting illuminated, is the side on the right-hand side. Now, if you look at Luca della Robbia's work, this pristine white, okay, and we know that it was on the right-hand side, Luca della Robbia's work probably did not need color. The natural light created a natural chiaroscuro, making the reliefs more evident. With shadow, it actually brought them out. So therefore, color wasn't needed. If you look at Donatello's Cantoria on the left-hand side, okay, the north side or the left-hand side receives less light during the day, and the relief sculpture is dependent on light for contrast. So what did Donatello do? He used colored decorations in order to make the work more visible. And that's why we have porphyry, bronze, gold, cut glass, and color on his works. Now, where were the Cantoria? Okay, how did they look? Okay, and this is the first very basic reconstruction of how these Cantoria probably looked. Okay, Luca della Robbia is at right, Donatello's is at left. Okay, obviously I couldn't actually get the light correct on the actual works working with Photoshop, but this is what, okay, the Duomo looked inside, okay, up until the 1680s. Now, what could we draw from this? What conclusions? The works in the original location, in essence, enhances the interior of the cathedral. The Cantoria give it a little more movement, okay, enhance the visual impact. And Donatello's perhaps more visible use of color was, you could almost say, in comparison or actually in competition with Luca della Robbia's as well. So in seeing these works in their original location, it's sort of you get an understanding of how they actually, are seen, why they actually look the way they do. Let's move on, still with Donatello, and let's go to his St. George of 1420, this work that's now in the Bargello. We know that it was commissioned by the Armorers Guild for a niche in Or San Michele in 1420. So it was for the guild that actually made instruments of war. Now, St. George in his niche is seen as a medieval knight, fully clad in armor, looking out defiantly from the niche. Art historical sort of descriptions and sort of explanations of this work cite the determined face, the calm energy of the stance, and the psychological intensity of St. George, which is all well and good. But if you look at the work very closely, there are indications that the work was originally viewed in a different manner than today in the Bargello. Now, perhaps the Armorers Guild intended the sculpture to display something other than just psychological intensity. Now, the indications I'm going to talk about tonight, I got these from a friend of mine who did a cast of the David several years ago, about 15, 20 years ago, when you could still actually touch it. And he told me that the back of the head has a support for a helmet, and that the right hand, which you can actually see as you go into the museum, is slightly opened as if it held an object. And the marble on his right thigh also indicates that it supported some sort of an object, so that there were attributes, on this sculpture. There were also indications of gold touches on the work, and I actually received this information from two other restorers who said, yes, it was gilded, but they didn't want to have their names mentioned because they were afraid that if this information got out, they would actually never work again, because someone's actually working on this. So it might be the first time. I don't mean to steal anyone's thunder. So we know that there were indications of attributes on the work and that it was gilded. Well, how do we sort of reconstruct this? If you do a little bit of investigative research, the relief right under St. George and the dragon gives information for the helmet and also the sword that were typical of the early Renaissance. And if you look at Donatello's previous works, like the Cavalcanti Annunciation that I mentioned before, you realize that all of the most decorated, highly sculpted details are gilded to bring them out, which might create some sort of a precedent. And this would give us this, a reconstruction of St. George in the time that it was actually produced. Now, what do we see here? We see St. George with a helmet, perhaps even gilded hair. Now, these are reconstructions I'm still working on. The finer points of the armor are actually gilded. He has a sword in his hand, so he's not just standing, not just his stance that's calm and energetic. It's the sword and the elements of war he actually has on him. And the shield has this gold cross, as well. Now, what conclusions can we draw from seeing a sculpture like this? Or if we see it slightly from the side, seeing George in the glistening light, on Or San Michele, it must have been absolutely spectacular. What can we conclude from this? Well, you can conclude that it's vastly different than the sculpture that we see today in the Bargello. George was armed. George had gold on him. I call him George just because it's easier to say George. And we can say, well, the gold, if you go back to the ancient aesthetic, the touch of the gold may have reinforced the sainthood of St. George and given him this luster of divinity, much like Roman sculpture with this gold gilded Marcus Aurelius. Very, very similar. But if you look at where the gold is, these gold touches enhance the armor, the helmet, the shield. This may have been what the guild desired to showcase, their products. The gold allows for a greater appreciation of their craftsmanship. The details of the armor, which are gilded, brings them out. So the actual sword, the actual helmet displayed the wares, which were more important or maybe on the same level as this psychological significance that art historians sometimes cite. He was a billboard in certain cases, a gilded, sculpted billboard, if I could say that. Now, if we stay with Donatello and go to his bronze David, also in the Bargello, one of the most famous works of the early Renaissance. We all know, from what the information tells, we're not sure exactly when it was done, but we know that it was perhaps commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici, between 1446 and 1460. I think it first shows up in an inventory in 1449, if I'm not mistaken. We know that it was for the center or in the courtyard of the Medici Palace, which is going up at the exact same time. Remember, it's Brunelleschi that submits a design. This gets rejected, and Michelozzo comes in and produces this amazing palace. It was outside in the Medici Palace, in other words, in their courtyard, for an extended period of time. And then it was eventually moved to the Bargello Museum. When they began to restore the David and clean it in the early 2000s, the original appearance of the work started to become evident. What they found was an extensive use of gold on the work. There were indications of gold hair, the wings of Goliath's helmet, the small decorations on the sword, the ribbons in the hair, the leaves on the hat, and also the boots. And if you look at some of the photographs in this book published by the restorers, you realize, okay, that some of the gold started to come out underneath the cleaning, especially in the hair, okay, and also in the ribbons and on the leaves on top of the hat, which leads us to the conclusion that this was completely gilded in certain cases. Now, this is the reconstruction of the David the way Donatello may have intended it. Now, the reconstruction to our eyes may seem a little bit gaudy, okay, but the golden touches enhance the bronze and bring out the smaller details. And it's an image, I think, of wealth, which is what the Medici intended it to be. Remember, this is bronze with gold on top of it. Now, if you look at the comparison, you can see that, yes, this is what we admire. This is what I've admired for years in the Bargello. Looking at this almost detracts a little bit, but this is probably what the Medici wanted. But it doesn't stop there. We have to understand that the work was not meant to be seen in a museum. The work was meant to be seen in the courtyard of the Medici Palace. And it may provide, if you reconstruct it, okay, for more interpretations of the Medici's intention of the work, if we see it in the courtyard for which it was actually made. Now, this is a grand view of the courtyard of the Medici Palace. I'm sure all of you who have been in there, you realize that there are Baroque decorations. When the Riccardi family actually bought the palace, I've canceled them out and tried to bring it back to its original sort of appearance in the 1400s. This is the sculpture on its original base. I actually did some research on finding the base upon which it stood. Okay, and this is a basic reconstruction. This is a little bit closer. This may have been what the Medici wanted people to see, okay, in the Medici Palace, completely sort of framed perfectly by the Brunelleschian arches of gray Pietraserena, a magnificent sort of contrast with this gold, okay, and the bronze. Well, what can we conclude from this then, when we put the sculpture back in its original location? If we step back and look at the art historical interpretation, we know that David, Donatello's David, was the first nude of the Renaissance. David was long associated as a symbol of the small Florence against the Goliaths of these larger city-states. And also it showed the defiant spirit of the Florentines. But this David image was usurped by the Medici, who used it for its own propaganda purposes. Now, the David represented, I think, the Medici's revivalist taste. Okay, it is no sort of mistaken that, okay, or it's actually sort of generally accepted that Cosimo was, okay, sort of the true Renaissance man, went back to these ancient ideals. And if you look at the sculpture itself, the gilded bronze David probably would not have been done by the city of Florence, mainly just for the economic reasons. It was extremely expensive to cast bronze and gild it as well. And I think one of the conclusions we could maybe draw from this is that the money they spent on the casting and gilding of the David made the image of the David theirs, because it was in their palace. And we have to understand that this palace, even though it was their own private palace, it could also be seen from outside, okay, from these large doors. If you ever walk down Via Cavour, you could see the work, okay, you could see the interior from the street as well. And I think that the gold details allowed for a classically inspired Renaissance sculpture, the symbol of Florence, to be seen from a distance in the Medici context, which I think is extremely important. Now, let's move on to the High Renaissance, section 4, Michelangelo's David. I think we're all, okay, familiar with this work. And I think the David is a prime example of how today's tastes have been conditioned by this modern museum approach to exhibiting works. If you've ever walked in, well, I'm sure you have, into the Academia, you can realize as you walk down that long corridor, we have this theatrical view of David. And this is in this amazing atrium by the Fabris with the light coming from above. And if we get into a very short history about the David, we know that the David was carved from a block of marble that had been in the elements for decades in the Opera del Duomo. It was actually carved into by several sculptors, such as Antonio Rossellini in the 1470s. It was a bad piece of marble. And in comes this quote-unquote unknown sculptor, Michelangelo, on the 16th of August, 1501. He receives a commission, takes off some of the older sort of workings, and begins to work on the block itself. If we realize what David was intended for, David was intended to go up on top of a buttress for the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. And this is a resin copy that was hoisted up on top in 2012, which I took some photographs. So Michelangelo was carving it, this bad piece of marble, to go up on top of the buttress of the cathedral, to be seen from high up and also basically from far below. Now, when Michelangelo gets the David commission, Florence, under this new sort of a Gonfaloniere, Pier Soderini, this newer public, is looking for large public works to reinforce this new freedom after decades of the Medici and also the turbulent years of Savonarola, after those 4 years under Savonarola. And upon completion of the sculpture, the David, because of its quality, gets immediately politicized and deemed anti-Medician, an anti-Medician symbol. In fact, right when Michelangelo finished it, on the 25th of January, 1504, a meeting was held in which there was Piero di Cosimo, I think there was Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and all of them decided that it should be placed in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of Florentine power. When they decided this, it had to be moved, and 3 or 4 months later, on the 14th of May, 1504, the statue of David was taken out of the Opera del Duomo. They literally had to break the door of the Opera del Duomo to get him out, and they put it in the piazza. Immediately that night, it gets pelted with stones. Now, I have to thank a friend of mine, Victor Kunin, who actually found the documents that these 3 youths were actually arrested. They were from very wealthy families, all pro-Medician, and they didn't like this anti-Medician big white sculpture, that was going to be put in front of the Palazzo Vecchio. Now, it was guarded, and we know that immediately a wooden structure was constructed to transport it to the Piazza della Signoria. And it took 4 days to arrive. It's an amazing story. I wish I could go into it. It was eventually set up on the Ringhiera, right in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, on the 8th of July, in 1504. But the documents that we have from this imply that it was completely covered up, I would assume, with some sort of a shed, some sort of a wooden sort of shed. Now, if you want to read one of the best books on the Renaissance, one of the best books, actually the best book on the Renaissance, it's by Luca Landucci. It's called The Florentine Diary. It's actually, he was an apothecary, and he writes down what happens in Florence from 1450 to 1516. It's absolutely fantastic. And on the 14th of May, 1504, this is what he says when the David gets brought outside of the Opera del Duomo. The said giant had been made by Michelangelo Buonarroti. That's it, Now, we know that the work continued on the statue until September. That means all throughout the summer, and that it was unveiled on the 8th of September, the feast day of the Madonna. And on that day, Luca Landucci writes in his diary, the giant in the piazza was finished and completely uncovered. Now, they were probably working on the base, but they were probably working on the sculpture. Why would you cover up a sculpture for 3 or 4 months? Not only to protect it. Well, it actually sort of creates the question, was Michelangelo's David then gilded like Donatello's? Now, art historians believe that the David was covered up to allow Michelangelo to rework the statue. It's highly unlikely if anyone's ever worked in marble. Once you get those proportions in, there's no marble left that really change them. Now, I think that there arose a need to embellish the work in the ancient aesthetic. In other words, gilding various parts of the statue. And we even have documents that attest to this. On the 31st of October, 1504, okay, after almost 30 days after it actually was unveiled, the government decided to pay the people who did the work, okay, which happens often in Italy, to Francesco di Bernardo Goldbeater for gilding the cigna, which was the belt or the cinch, and the broncone, the branch, which probably was the tree trunk, and the ghirlanda, the garland or wreath of the giant. And then there's another document to Francesco di Pietro dell'Orto, painter, for having gilded the broncone of the giant and the cigna and the ghirlanda. So they were two individuals working on this. Okay, now this means that gold leaf was put on the David. There's another document from the 31st of October, 1504, to Bastiano di Domenico Cennini, goldsmith, for a brass wire with 28 copper leaves, and for mounting or soldering or welding the said leaves on the said wire, mounted with silver, for the giant. So he must have had either a garland on the head, which I don't think is too likely, or some sort of a garland around his waist. Now this, okay, means that the sling, the tree trunk, and most likely the hair was gilded. And he probably also had some sort of a girdle of leaves around the waist that was also placed on the sculpture. Now this invites, based on the documents, a reconstruction of what it would look like the day it was unveiled. Okay. Now this, again, is a reconstruction, a proposal of what someone in September of 1504, on the 8th of September, saw Michelangelo's David for the first time. And I think we have to realize that the golden hair, the attributes, must have glistened in the sun, made it more than just a sculpture, made it a big gold-gilded sculpture as well. And this is what we see. Okay, maybe the gilding is a little bit too bright. Okay, the gilded leaves were actually taken from one of Ghiberti's, in other words, the idea of one of Ghiberti's figures of Adam. Okay, but this goes against, I would assume, okay, our natural sort of tendency to gravitate towards, I should say, pristine white David. Okay, now, if you look at the gilding of the David analytically, the gilding of the David revives this ancient aesthetic of using color or gold to enhance the overall appearance, just like Donatello did for the Medici David. And if you look at the David with his gilded hair, it also continues the tradition of gilded hair and the attributes of Donatello as well. So it seems that there's some sort of connection between the Medici gilded David and the New Republic, okay, of Florence's gilded David. Okay, I think in a certain case, in a certain sense, there was an attempt by this New Republic to take back the image of David from the Medici, saying, okay, ours is bigger and has a lot more gold on it, okay, and we're right in front of our own city hall, okay, unabashedly nude, okay. Now, section 5, let's try to draw some conclusions from all this. I think we have to sort of understand that sculptures were initially made to address a specific context, a church, a piazza, a palace. There is a modern tendency, and I'm not saying that it's wrong, okay, but there's a tendency to extract, to isolate, to generalize in order to meet the museum aesthetic, okay? And in some cases, it ignores the original intention of the work. If you place sculptures, okay, back in their original location with their original decoration and coloring, okay, things start to come back out, the visual impact, and also the relationship with the viewer, also the intention perhaps of the patron. Now, with the loss of coloring, okay, the original coloring, and the removal of work to museums, this intended message is lost or in certain cases de-emphasized. And in certain cases, what happens, we have these consequential sort of misinterpretations in certain cases. Now, returning sculptures to their original context and appearance allows to discern or maybe sort of infer the initial desired message, in this case, the Medici and the David inside their own palace. And I think if we can reconstruct Renaissance works according to the aesthetics of the period, I think that this will allow us to re-examine their significance. And I think that it also opens up new insights into the intended message, which gives us a better understanding of how they were seen. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alan. Excellent lecture, as we come to expect from you. Very stimulating. Think of these things like that. So, questions and answers. Usual protocol in the room. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, put your hand up and I'll bring you the mic. You can use the mic so that people on the Zoom can hear us. Zoomers, if you want to contribute, you can put something in the chat and I'll read it out on your behalf. Or if you're feeling bold, you can unmute and talk to us. It's nice to hear your voices. And whilst you're thinking here, we've got a couple on the chat already. So Nancy Scherer says, somehow we don't seem to mind colorfully painted terracotta sculptures like most of those from Della Robbia and the Sienese sculpture of the Virgin in the Bardini. I'm guessing because the color on fired clay doesn't wear away so easily. So we've just seen more of this gaudiness in such sculptures and ceramics. And I'll give another one from Elizabeth Wicks, who's a restorer. Even though many centuries have passed, there ought to be a way to scientifically assess where any gilding would have been done by looking for minuscule traces of mordant or glue which have been absorbed into the marble. There you go. There's two very good comments and questions. Alan.
There is. Oh, shit.
Yeah, you need to have a mic on.
In fact, I was trying to look for this article that was published a long time ago when they were cleaning the David. They actually found remnants of charcoal dust on the hair of the David. And what's interesting is that if you go to Cennino Cennini's treatise on art, okay, the Liber dell'Arte, and I looked up gilding stone sculptures. And how do you gild stone sculptures? You actually have to clean off the surface. You have to crush charcoal, okay? You have to apply that with a glue on the surface. And that basically acts as a barrier between the stone, which is hygroscopic, absorbs all the moisture. And then on top of that, after it's completely dry, you then put on your mordant gilding, in other words, your bowl, and then your gold. So some of the traces on the works actually gives the indications that, yes, there was gilding on it based on, if you go back to Cennino Cennini's treatise on art, on how you actually gild the stoneworks. Yeah.
Okay, in the room, have we got any contributions? Duncan down the front.
Thank you, Alan. Brilliant talk as always.
Thank you.
If you go to a school for picture restorers, they are told as far as possible to reproduce what the artist intended. Is the same thing, is that sort of movement still now going on into a sculpture restoring?
Okay, in fact, it depends, and it's a good question, and it depends on where you are. Remember that there's two concepts. There's conservation and then there's restoration. Conservation is to stop the decay. And I think mainly people are conservators, or trying to stop the decay or slow it down because everything is going to decay. Restoring is actually trying to restore it to its original appearance. And they really don't do that anymore. Okay, maybe they'll have a trattino, like little spaces and frescoes. They'll put a lot of different colors and stuff like that. If you're talking with antique dealers, then that whole discourse goes out the window. I know, and I've actually had people ask me to restore things, reintegrate things, change things, because they're going to put it on sale as well. So I think that the traditional concept of restoration, I think today, is conservation, just stopping the decay, cleaning it, but that's about it. They could never put gold back on Donatello's David. They would never do it to Michelangelo's David, because we really can't be sure what it actually looked like as well. But I don't hope that answers your question. Yes.
It is indeed slightly shocking to see them with gold hair. I note that on the comment, Sarah has, on my behalf, put up our weekly reminder to the Zoomers to contribute through the Just Giving portal if you can. There's about 50, 60 people in the room with us tonight, and they've all paid up front to be here. There's another 50 odd on the Zoom and you haven't. So I just invite you to do your bit. I know we can't give you wine, but we do need to keep this wonderful program going. Thank you very much in advance. Okay, more in the room, more on the Zoom. We've got another one from Paul.
Oh, Alan, thank you. Fascinating as ever. Obviously, seeing the works in their original setting is really sort of quite dramatic, and you get a completely sort of different context. Is there any sort of movement within museums in Florence to either, put the original work back in its original setting for a period of time, or even to try and recreate it within the museum so that you get a different perspective on it?
I would hope so, but I to this day I've never seen anything like it. Specifically, also the Donatello's David in the Medici Palace. It would be interesting to just set up a copy of it. I think the closest thing they actually got to was taking that resin copy of the David and hoisting it up to the buttress. I think they moved it to underneath the Loggia dei Lanzi, which was another a possibility. But that I think was the only one that was done with a resin work. It would be extremely interesting to recreate it because I think it changes our perception completely in certain cases.
I mean, in parallel with the copy of the David in the Piazza and the copy of the St. George on Orsin San Michele as copies. So why not get somebody who could do a
gilding
of the bronze?
Sure.
And the Medici Riccardi. It'd be great. My thought actually on this was that you got the Loggia dei Lanzi, which is full of fine classical and Renaissance sculpture. Was most of that collected and put there from the go-get? Was it commissioned for that space, or was that an early example of the museum aesthetic coming in at the Renaissance time?
I think the latter more so than the form, especially the even the John Bologna's Hercules and Centaur. I think the club is actually it has a bit of color in it. So I think the tendency was to add a little bit of color, but I think by that time it actually sort of totally.
And were most of those works commissioned to be in the loggia, or were they collected from elsewhere? Do you know?
The Cellini's Perseus was, I think, Cosimo I, and that was a political warning to his enemies. He had wanted that right from the very beginning, and that's real interesting. The other ones I would have to check. It's a good question, though.
It's a fantastic sculpture.
Yeah.
And they are all of them, original still.
Yeah, pretty much.
And they've been there for a long
time. Yeah.
Anyone more on the Zoom? There's a bit of fan mail from Penny Howard, Eunice, and Patricia Thomas, all saying fantastic. Which I would agree. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else in the room? Yes, we are.
Thank you for another fascinating lecture.
Thank you.
Do we know what Michelangelo thought about the change in the positioning of a David?
It's a really good question because, again, my friend of mine, Victor Koonin, wrote a really good book. It's called From Stone to Flesh. And he actually flushed all this out. He went through all the documents. Michelangelo had no say whatsoever. I've even heard somebody say what Michelangelo said, if it doesn't get put in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, he's going to bash it to pieces. It's really not documented. Okay, apparently it's not get documented. We do know that I think through one of the people who were present at the meeting, he expressed some of his desires, but he's not mentioned at all in the documents. It was all from other. Yeah, it's very difficult to discern. Obviously, he already gotten paid wherever they wanted to put it. It's like, really, I don't think it really mattered. Remember, he lived with the Medici too. He grew up with it. He saw the David. He saw Donatello's David exactly the way I reconstructed it. It was really interesting. And then he flips and goes anti-Medician. Really interesting.
Okay.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. The idea of the ancients with the color on them up through the Renaissance, is there a language of color? I mean, as far as like, why is it red instead of blue? Why is it gold instead of silver?
Right. That's something. There's been a lot written on this, specifically in Greek. And again, there are techniques where with infrared reflectology and all these other infrared things, you can actually determine what colors were. I actually asked one of my old professors, Sarantis Simianoglu, about this, about the use of color. What was it all? And it was mainly just to so they can be seen. It was like relishing in the color. If there was a specific sort of code, like a color code, that I'm really not sure. When it comes to gold on bronze and stuff like that, there's so many that I could have put in here. I didn't want to bore everyone. Like the bronze boxer in the Palazzo Massimo in Rome that has even copper blood coming out of him, which is very, very sort of. So I think there was this use of color, just the use of color itself, I think was extremely, extremely important. But looking into the actual codification, I'm not really sure. It's a good question.
What's another one over there? No. You're finding out this. Okay. Any more for any more? Zoomers, anyone feel like talking to us? It's your turn. Yeah, here we are.
Hello, Simon. Hello. Hi, Simon. I wanted to ask a question. I'm sorry, my memory of when the Reformation was and when the Counter-Reformation was is a bit hazy at the moment. But I was just wondering, would that have had any relevance at all in the placement of the gold, the gilding, in the two Davids, the Donatello David and the Michelangelo David?
That's something I never really considered. Probably to make them more palatable and less sort of luxurious. Again,
I'm just noting, Alan, that the genitalia are covered, according to your theory about the gilding.
Right. In fact, I was going to mention this.
Michelangelo David.
Right. No, in fact, I was going to mention this, and I forgot to. Is that one of the theories was that not the genitalia that was actually had to be covered up, but his left flank that was a little bit too sensual. And I'm not really sure. You know, one of those things you hear so many years ago from a professor, and you have to, and we actually look for it, and you can't find it anymore. It's almost impossible. But I think there was sort of I think that may have been a factor just to make them a little more palatable to people.
Brenda, a good way to look at the impact of Reformation on Michelangelo's art is to go to Sistine Chapel.
Yeah,
the
definitely.
ceiling was done before the Reformation,
right? And then
the Last Judgment on the altar wall was done after the Reformation. And
yes,
a very marked contrast in the aesthetic and the intention of the artists.
Definitely.
Actually, short commercials. A woman called Jeannie Marshall, who's written an extraordinary book called Learning to See in the Sistine Chapel, and she's coming here at the beginning of December. And that's where I got that piece of information from. And she lives in Rome, has done for a long time, and she did after a long time being reluctant to go into Sistine Chapel because of all the hassle of doing so. She went, and then she got obsessed, and she went going repeatedly over a number of years and started to think about everything by looking at the ceiling. And strongly recommend the book, and we're delighted that she'll be coming here in December. Okay, any more? Getting towards wine time.
Just it's me again, Simon.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Sorry, it's just me again. It's nothing very important. It's just a comment that where we live out here in Chianti, there's a vineyard called Nitardi, and it was owned by Michelangelo. And when he was doing the ceiling, he sent a message up to the farm to say, send a case of wine down to the Pope. And ever since that time, the current owners, who are German, they actually send wine to the new Pope.
Nice tradition. Thank you for that. Local information for Chianti.
It's a good segue into the wine.
Yeah. Lots of fan mail from Katerina and Stephen and Jody and Elizabeth and Shirley. You've got a big group around the world following you tonight. That's awesome. So just remains to thank Lynn Barton again for sponsoring tonight. Thanks, Lynn. Great. And to also thank our seasoned wine partners, Castiglione del Bosco, whose wine we're about to enjoy. Sorry, Zoomers, as always. Hey, have one on us. But most of all, to thank Alan for lovely.
You're very welcome. Thank you all. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Simon. I appreciate it.